Hello and welcome to Poke the Meta, a show about the Japanese Pokemon TCG metagame. This week, I'd like to shed some light on what might be my favorite card from the Sun and Moon collections. That card happens to be the first trial captain, Ilima. Ilima is a supporter from the Sun collection, or Sun and Moon base for you international players, that forces both players to shuffle their hand into their deck and then flip a coin. If heads, the player draws 6. If tails, they draw 3. Some older players or collectors might realize that this is almost a direct reprint of the Team Galactic's Wager card, with just a coin flip being played instead of rock, paper, scissors. Team Galactic's Wager was never an end-all be-all supporter for the formats it appeared in, but it did make for some interesting situations and mind games that could disrupt an opponent late in the game. While I won't get into the whole rock, paper, scissors as a highly strategic game, and playing that instead of leaving it all to chance on a coin flip is not only better, but it requires skill, discussion, the effect that still gets provided is what draws me to the new version of this card. So let's talk about some of the situations Ilima can be helpful. Turn 1, going first. Turn 1 with advantage is such a powerful position to be in any game. After playing out your first hand, then dropping an Ilima can ruin your opponent's game from the get-go. Even if you flip tails, you have played out one entire hand, as compared to your opponent, who's just maybe laid down their active or bench Pokemon. You still run the advantage by forcing their play. If your opponent has dropped to 3 cards in this situation, they may be forced to drop out some important resources a little bit earlier than they had planned to. Maybe it's searching out an early Shaman or a Tapu Lele to draw back some cards they may have lost. I still consider this disrupting your opponent. Any situation where you force your opponent like that should be counted as a personal win. Another example is sealing the deal late game. When you're in a winning position and most likely running low on draw supporters, and you're staring down that in-hand in for 2, but it would refresh your opponent to 4 to 6 cards, consider Ilima. It can still drop both of you to 3 cards, but that still gives you more cards than the in would have in that situation, but with the added bonus of it potentially giving you 6. Sure, you might run into this situation from time to time where you do give your opponent 6 cards, but if you were going to play in that situation, it wouldn't have made any difference. You would have just gotten less cards, no matter what. Of course, when you're running Ilima or any card that requires a coin flip, you do rely on luck. In the current metagame of Japan, most decks are playing somewhere between 9 and 16 supporters. Of course, everybody's still running 4 VS Seekers, but since we play in the XY format, most people are still playing 1 to 2 battle compressors for early game synergy. About 6 to 8 of your supporters are going to be draw supporters, 4 of which will almost always be Professor Sycamore. The other 2 to 3 slots that you have open, most commonly those 2 to 3 spots are going to be filled by in. But Lily has been seeing a lot more play since Tapu Lele has entered the format. While I would agree that in is probably the best play for almost every situation, there are 2 other supporters in this format that do a similar action and could be beneficial to run as well. Those cards happen to be Judge and Ilima. If you're unfamiliar with the cards in and Judge, I'll go over what they do real quick. In is a supporter that forces both players to shuffle their hand into their deck, and then draw a number of cards equal to how many prizes they have left. While Judge is a supporter that forces both players to shuffle their hand into their deck, and then draw 4. Now you can see why these cards are all similar. They all force you and your opponent to shuffle your hands, and then draw a specific number of cards. They both have the potential for disruption, and they can draw you cards. It is such a powerful and popular card across the world, and as it should be. It's a card that can win you tournaments. This card is a devastating play that can lead to late game comebacks. It's won everything from, Little League championships all the way up to Worlds. It's a card that should honestly be in almost every single deck out there. I'm lame. I'm a really, really lame guy, and I'm one of those lame contrarians who just doesn't really like to play in. Now, I still do more often than not. I like to pair them with other cards. Usually it's a 2-1 split. 2 in and another card. Until Sun and Moon dropped, I was typically playing 2 in and a Judge. Something about giving my opponent a hand late game, always kind of bothers me. Oftentimes I would run the Judge for a turn 1 play and drop my opponent to 4 before they get to take a turn. Even in the mid game, I would rather give myself 4 cards and give my opponent 4 cards than give them 6 and me only, 2 to 3. It's an equalizer. But with In, Judge, and Ilima all together in the format, what options do you have? With In, it will always be the best play. It's always the most versatile card that you can play. Whether it be early game, turn to turn in the mid, or even in late game, the card can be very beneficial to you. But not only you, it can actually help your opponent. While sure, most people look at In and think it's a disruption card, it can disrupt my opponent, it also does have the potential to give your opponent a better hand. And not only just a better hand than you. And I'm just strictly talking in card size. This is why I kind of see In as a little bit of a pain to play. Sure, you may be winning and have 2 prizes left while your opponent is trailing behind with maybe, 4 to 5. Playing the In is only going to give you 2 cards. While it may not be the most optimal thing that you could have played at the time, it's just giving your opponent more cards to play with. And sure, the 2 cards you may draw in that end may be the 2 cards that you need to win the game. It's still a gamble. With Judge, I said earlier that it's an equalizer. It sets both players to 4 cards. It's similar to In by forcing both players to shuffle and draw, but Judge is a more consistent card. It will always give you 4, and it will always give your opponent 4. It's not the best, but it's definitely not the worst. In most situations, you can actually find out that Judge may be the more optimal play over In, just because you're always going to set both players to 4. But it's not a strong turn to turn when In and Ilima can give you the option for getting a bigger hand and giving your opponent a smaller hand. Again, it'll always be consistent that it gives you 4 and your opponent 4, but it may not be the best every turn. And while Ilima is a coin flip in the dark, it can give you a massive advantage at any point in the game. I've been very fortunate with my coin flips with Ilima, and I've actually won a couple of tournaments by just shutting down my opponent in the early game. And while sure, I've had the few games where I turn 1, get set to 3, and it sets my opponent up with 6, and I have a harder time trying to win, more often than not, the card has been very beneficial to me. Ilima at any turn can give you 6 cards and disrupt your opponent into 3, but it can also do the opposite and give you a 3-card hand while setting up your opponent with a bigger and better play on the next turn. This is often seen as a bad thing in the Pokemon trading card game. Most players don't like coin flips. That's why every deck doesn't run for Crushing Hammer. But it is also the reason why we don't see Professor Birch's running everywhere. Coin flips can make or break anything in this game. Whether it be the very first coin flip at the start of the game for you international players, or the Crushing Hammer that you need to throw away the last energy in play on your opponent's side of the field. But if you're one of those people that have a lot of luck going their way, I really suggest looking at Ilima just a little bit more when building a deck. Here's a last minute statistic for all of you while building decks with Ilima. Since Ilima's release in the Sun and Moon collection, I have played at least 1 copy of Ilima for 8 tournaments. Out of those 8 tournaments, I've won 5 of them. A lot of the games have come down to the Ilima, and I'm not kidding about that. A lot of times I throw it away, early game with an Ultra Ball or Battle Compress or whatever, and it has served me well in the late game. There were other times where I drop the Ilima turn 1 and then just win because my opponent can't set anything up afterwards. With that, I think it's been integral in the decks that I've played, but again, I can clearly see that it's not the greatest card that's ever been made. But I absolutely love playing it. And while it may just be the wacky, weird XY format that we play over here, I love it. A lot of times it really disrupts, and I can't stress enough that I think more people should look at this card. So with all that, here's a supporter skeleton for all of you. Take it and test around with Ilima. This is a good foundation and starting point for any deck list you want to build. Of course, it's just the supporters, but supporters are some of the most important cards in any deck. And again, while Ilima may not be the most optimal card for each and every one of you, I totally think it's worth trying. Just play around with it and see how it works for you. Also, let me know how it worked out for you in the comments below, and tell me, what other cards you'd like to see in the future. So thanks for watching, everyone. I've been Burezu, and this was Poke the Meta.